Stock Market Documentary Channel presents.
Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you today.
Happy Monday, Dr. Paul.
Very good. There's a lot of talk over the weekend about a famous boxer who just passed away, Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay. That's the name I remember originally, and I remember very clearly, when he switched over to Islam and became Muhammad Ali. But there's a lot of rehashing about his greatest fights, and he was, one of the greatest, if not the greatest boxer. I think he only lost 5 matches in a whole lifetime. So there's a lot of emphasis in the build-up and the dramatic and all his antics before the fights, and it was all promotional as far as I was concerned, the way he did that. But anyway, we want to talk about him in a little bit different aspect. Everybody recognizes he was a good fighter, and that's what brought him to fame. But he had some other qualities that I want to talk about. I remember just a few years ago, '07, I believe, they were celebrating his birthday and his effort to try to improve the conditions of people living in poverty. And I went down to the floor because everybody was praising his social efforts as well as his fighting expertise. So I went down and talked about his conflict with the U.S. government on being drafted. And many people remember very clearly the statement he made when he would not be drafted. He said, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. They never called me names and they never hurt me." So in a way, he almost right there spoke our foreign policy. No quarrel. He doesn't need to go there. But even earlier than when I gave that little talk on the House floor in 2011, I wrote a book called Liberty Defined. You're familiar with it.
I heard of that.
There's
yes.
one chapter in there I talk about civil disobedience, which is something that to me is very important. Martin Luther King pushed it, and I used Muhammad Ali as a practicing person on civil disobedience. And I even admit in the book that, I was no hero there because even though I recognize and maybe do it someday, that I had chosen other paths, to bring attention to it. But I wanted to recognize him, and I want to take 1 minute. There's a very short passage in here about Muhammad Ali and when he refused to be drafted. So right after he was convicted, and we'll go into his the process of him refusing to be inducted and the legal court, the cases that it went through. But immediately afterwards, there was a well-known sports writer. This would have been in '67. Harold Conrad immediately said after the conviction and sentencing, quote, "He threw his life away on one toss of the dice for something he believed in. Not many folks do that," and that's close quote. And my statement was, true, not many folks do that. But I disagree that he threw his life away. That fight against the state, he eventually won, though at a cost, and history may show that it was the best of all his fights and the one that should have given him the greatest sense of dignity and pride. And that was the end of the statement there. But also, he gave up a lot of material benefits, and there's some writers today that are pointing out there aren't many great athletes that would be willing to give up a title and give up 3 years of income. So he truly believed in what he's talking about and was truly a man of principle. But the trial and all, did you learn anything by reviewing that on how that all came about?
It was a very interesting set of events that set it off. In 1962, when he turned 18, he registered for the draft, as it was required at that time, and still is. He was classified as 1A because his IQ level measured in the 16th percentile, which was too low. And there's a funny quote at the time when he found this out. He said, "Well, I said I was the greatest, not the smartest." But things change as wars tend to change things, and by 1967, the Army kept lowering its standards until he was indeed eligible. And by '66, they lowered their standards until he was eligible. And the fateful date, and it's very, very dramatic, April 28th, 1967, just up the road in Houston. He was standing at the induction office, and there was a white line when his name was called, he refused to step forward. And by doing that, he indicated that he refused to be drafted into the military to fight the Vietnam War. And that set everything off. Very dramatic.
You know, what impressed me about that whole process was how quickly the Boxing Commission took his title away. I mean, they weren't going to mess around with this because this was unpatriotic and he was un-American, and he suffered tremendously from the criticism, but he stood his ground. He had no intention on backing down. But not only did the Boxing Commission come down hard on him, the state came down hard on him. So it was just a week or so later, they indicted him. A month later after that, by June, they sentenced him. And they just weren't going to waste time, and they had to set an example. So basically, he didn't have many defenders back at that time. I think that I thought it was an interesting relationship between him and with Martin Luther King. Yes. And because there were reasons for them not to get too close, and yet there were reasons to be in agreement. And I think, if I had to guess, I think Ali had more influence on King, vice versa, but nobody knows that. But of course, when Ali, came out against the war, very closely after that, Martin Luther King came out against the war as well, and everybody thought these were terrible, terrible people, until it wasn't too long after that, a president by the name of Johnson had to resign because the American people more or less said, these guys are right, this is a stupid war, and everybody detested the draft.
You know what's so striking in the way you just described what happened is how quickly the organs of entertainment, the private sector, the news, become agents of the state. You know, the Boxing Commission, which has nothing to do with the Vietnam War, decides to destroy his life. Just like nowadays, if you remember in the Iraq War, when a few of the presenters were not gung-ho enough, they found their shows canceled, people like Phil Donahue and the others. So they quickly become cheerleaders of the state's wars.
Yeah, and it exposes the issue of the deep state. When the media acts in accordance with the state, they're part of it. And of course, big business is part of that as well. But Ali stuck to his argument that he was a religious minister, and this was not only civil disobedience, but he had a right to be a conscientious objector. And this was the big issue in the courts. They argued that. And it's fascinating how the Supreme Court sort of went back and forth until finally he won with an 8-0 vote.
Yeah, it is incredible. He was influenced, I think in the late 50s, he first came across the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad and this sort of Americanist strain of Islam. And I think it influenced him very strongly, not just about anti-war, but social issues back here at home. But that, I think, was the beginning of his awakening in terms of these issues. And I think he used that to defend himself against the charges that he was not truly a conscientious objector.
Today we still hear it constantly about the nature of the religion of Islam. Is it peaceful, or is it, jihad, against Christians and all this? It goes back and forth, but I'm afraid that I hear too often on television the argument that it is a religious jihad, and they have this obligation, and Muhammad says kill all Christians and all this. And then there's the other side of it too, because of course from a personal experience I've met and know a lot of people who've practiced Islam, and I don't feel threatened. So, and I think that's the way, but there's no doubt that there's violence in Islam, and they sometimes use religion to justify their political goals, just as it was in the Old Testament, in early Judaism. A lot of killing and justification, for religious ground. God told them to do this, God told them to do this. And even today, if you're looking for people who promote violence, there's a fair number of Christians and Christian groups, a large number of people who were gung-ho over the crusade. It's a crusade. Of course, they had to drop that word because that brought up old memories. But yes, we need to go in there. We need to be in the Middle East. And so I sort of look at this, I try to be as objective as possible and look at what the religion really means to most people and sort of recognize that there are violent strains. But this subject came up with Muhammad Ali. He said, well, Islam, he claimed that the word Islam means peace. Of course, there's not a lot of people who would say that. No, it means jihad and all these other things. But his argument, and there is some defense of this, he said that the word actually comes from salam. It's similar, and that it actually means peace. But I don't think it's recognized generally. But in his mind, that's what it was. He believed that that it was not his obligation to go and fight these wars, and he had a racial tinge to this too, because why do brown people from the United States have to go and fight brown people somewhere else who haven't done anything to us? So it's amazing though how it was the patriotic thing to do, and if you didn't do it, you know, you weren't patriotic and you were a bad guy, and it certainly hit him hard.
That's interesting. You bring up the issue of Islam and how it affected him, and how, you know, if you were to stand up and say you think that Islam is generally a religion of peace, you would be ridiculed. But as you point out, what about in Christianity, the far fundamentalists who believe they've got to start World War III so that their savior will come back or something? This is every bit as radical as the jihadists. And on the other side of the coin, what about the millions of people in the Middle East who have been, the civilians who've been displaced from their homes because of Western intervention in their country? These people aren't violent jihadists, they're victims. Yeah. And this is one of the things that I came across, a great article, I shared it with you this morning, by Matt Taibbi, who we've known over the years, who now writes for Rolling Stone. And he points out that what Muhammad Ali did by refusing to go was denying the state its propaganda victory, showing that all of the cultural icons are in favor of this war. And it was a huge defeat that the Pentagon and the war machine learned a lot from, never to make the mistake again of allowing someone to oppose it like this.
And they recognized that the problem really was the draft. That's how it arose. They couldn't control the propaganda, but the people in the States got angry because there were people that were being drafted and sent over there and being killed, and not by small numbers. So that was a big issue, and I think it may turn out, the history will show, Muhammad Ali probably had more to do with not reinstating the active draft. I know when it was the registration was reinstated in 1979, we fought a battle on the House floor and had one victory, but then we lost it and they redid it. But nobody's thinking that tomorrow there's going to be a draft. Of course, the only recent argument is whether we're going to draft women or not, because that's the ace in the hold for the state. The state has to have this power if they really need it. But since the 70s up until now, I think the point that you made about the propaganda on the issue actually had an influence and called attention to the government. We better be very careful on, it's too hard to manage affairs if we get into these wars and drag people off. I mean, just think hundreds of thousands, I guess, have now, at least in the last 15 years, gone to the Middle East, and many of them still suffering from it, and families know about this, but it's still not like the 60s. I remember the 60s really well. It was massive. It was invaded the campuses. There's not too much excitement on the campus worrying about, what's going on with the military, and so they sort of can dismiss it.
But his public stance at the height of his popularity and career started to turn the tide among the American public against the war, and it wasn't long after that Taibbi points out that you had images like the running girl, if you remember, running down the street, and all of these horrible things that really started propelling the hearts and minds back in the U.S. against this horrible war. And Taibbi points out that the government learned from its mistakes there. And if I can read just a short sentence, because I think he captured it perfectly well. He said, "The lesson the government should have learned from this disastrous episode was not to try to project power and influence by military occupation. Instead, the Pentagon saw Vietnam as a public relations failure." And so that's what they set out to solve, the public relations failure. And Taibbi points out it's not very well recognized but the Pentagon has the largest PR budget in the world.
See, they're covering themselves for a philosophic moral failure. They don't even understand the clear-cut foreign policy of Muhammad Ali. I ain't got no qualms, no problems with the Viet Cong. What have they done to me? And most people, when they stop and think about it, that's mainly the case. But this propaganda machine is still working rather hard, because even though we're not being attacked daily by any jihadists in this country, matter of fact, in the scheme of things, very minor, and it's related to us being over there, but there's still a lot of people who are willing to go along with more military spending. I mean, both parties, more military spending, rebuild the military, and on and on. So the propaganda machine is still there, and I think that's our job, to try to counteract the propaganda machine and try to put it in a proper perspective. But right now, I don't see how that's going to come about until we're broke.
Well, one of the things that the Pentagon learned from Vietnam was to strictly control the media aspects of the war. And remember, when Iraq War II came especially, the media was embedded with the military, and they were not able to show things like caskets coming home. All of this was so carefully controlled. And that had the other effect that had was to dehumanize the enemy. You had people who were blamed for fighting against an occupation. They were the bad guys for fighting back. But why were we there in the first place? Those questions were never asked. So the Pentagon, through the billions of dollars it spends really to brainwash Americans, has turned the whole thing around. And sadly, it makes our job, I think, a lot harder.
There's no doubt about it. And hopefully the American people will wake up and do an assessment to find the truth about this. But right now, today, I think that we still live in great danger, not from somebody invading this country, not from somebody coming and bombing us, not from somebody using tanks to come in and take away our liberties. Of course, the excuse for us being over there is we have to go over there to protect American security and protect our Constitution. Going over and fighting wars that were undeclared, unconstitutionally there, has nothing to do with national security, and it's breaking the budget, and yet it's still accepted. So I think that the American people need to wake up and realize how detrimental an interventionist foreign policy is, and maybe we'll come around to having our senses, because like our institute, the Institute for Peace and Prosperity, that is our goal. Peace and prosperity comes from peace, not and a foreign policy that is completely different. And that, of course, should be the goal. I believe sincerely that Muhammad Ali was a conscientious objector, and like many point out, he was with flaws, as all of us are, but basically he was a man of great character. He was a man who was willing to give up wealth, and like was pointed out by some, how many great athletes today who's making millions of dollars are willing to do that? And there aren't very many, and he was, and he suffered for it. But I think he's been vindicated. I think right now, even those who despised him for years now see him as a hero. They forget about his flaws, and I think basically that is good. Let's hope we learn something and learn that his foreign policy may be simplistic and maybe not said eloquently, but it's very true. We ought to mind our own business and just come home and get out of the internal affairs of other nations and only fight wars that are declared. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our channel. Stock Market Documentary Channel presented.